A Dog's Life, The Autobiography of a Stray, by Anne M. Martin, published by Scholastic Press. Secret Dogs. Bone and I waited a very long time for Mother. That first morning, when we didn't know that she wasn't coming back, we entertained ourselves as we usually did. We hunted in the woods, we played by the stone wall, we visited the garbage heap and found bits of smoked turkey, a melon rind, coffee grounds, which we tasted but didn't like, and half a piece of cake with white frosting. We ate until our stomachs were quite fat. The day was very hot. It was so hot that the Marion children, who had been spraying one another with a garden hose in the morning, went indoors for their lunch and didn't come back outside. By the time the sun had reached its highest point and had started to pass over the Marions' backyard, the shed, even with its open window and door, had grown too stuffy for any creatures except the mice. Bone and I lay in the shade of the woods and waited for Mother. At the end of the day, when the shadows were long and the heat had faded a bit, Bone and I returned to the shed. I expected to find Mother in our nest. Sometimes now Mother left us for long periods of time, but she always came back by evening. Our nest was empty, though, and the shed was still stuffy. One of the cats poked his head through the door, sniffed at the dusty, dense air, turned, and left. Bone and I remained. I was hungry, and I suspect Bone was too, but we wanted Mother. The air cooled, darkness fell, the stars came out, and so did the bats, and still Mother did not appear. Bone and I curled into each other in our nest, our stomachs rumbling. I thought of the garbage heap, of the turkey and melon rind and cake, but Bone and I hadn't been outside in the night time by ourselves yet. Besides, surely Mother was on her way back to us. All that night Bone and I slept on the burlap sack, slept with our legs and tails entwined. I could feel Bone's breath on my neck. It was our first night without Mother, and it seemed very long. In the morning when I awoke, I saw Bone, 3 of the shed cats, and a mouse poking its head out of a flower pot, but no Mother. I knew that she was not going to come back at all. Bone and I were on our own. We were responsible for finding all of our food and water, and for remembering the many, many things Mother had taught us: how to stay out of trouble, when to snap and bite at an animal, to steer clear of humans and other dogs, to clean our wounds, to groom ourselves. We tried hard, and we managed fairly well. The garbage heap became our best friend. I do not understand emotions very well. I know what fear feels like, and I have been afraid many times. But I am less clear about words such as joy, happiness, sadness, and anger. Over the years I have heard humans, especially Susan, talk about these things, though, and I see how Susan appears when she says she's happy. Looking back, I think I was happy during the rest of that summer when Bone and I lived in the shed, that I was happy even though Mother was gone. The truth was that with mine gone as well, the Marions' property was a much more peaceful place, and our world seemed less threatening. Mine's kits had left too. The morning after their mother was killed, they tumbled out of their den, trotted into the woods, and just kept going. So the Marions' yard was free of foxes, and I was not to see the man with the gun for quite a while. Bone and I began to feel safe. The air cooled down after that one blistering day, and sometimes I saw the Marion children wearing the kind of clothes they had worn in the spring. Cooler air just meant that the shed was more comfortable, and just enough rain fell, enough to fill the buckets and watering cans that Bone and I drank from, but not so much that we couldn't go hunting. We were not very experienced hunters yet, my brother and I, but we caught enough small animals here and there so that our stomachs were usually full. If we had a bad day, we could always raid the garbage heap. Our lives were quiet. Bone and I played and hunted. We chased squirrels and chipmunks and each other. I finally made friends with some of the shed cats. One of them, Yellow Man, would wait for me in front of the nesting boxes each morning and rub his head under my chin before he left to spend the day in the woods. I even came to recognize the shed mice, every single one of them. I never thought of them as meals. They were my neighbors. It was a warm afternoon with the smell of cut grass in the air and bees humming in the bushes when Matthias discovered Bone and me. He took us by surprise. We had eaten breakfast at the garbage heap and were napping in the woods, our bellies full, when I heard the sound of crunching leaves and a hushed human voice. Bone and I jerked to attention. Here came Matthias, the boy who liked to sit under trees, the boy Mrs. Marion would tell to take his nose out of that book. He was carrying a book now and talking to himself, and his face looked like Susan's does after Mrs. Oliver had told her she's too old to be living on her own. Bone and I drew back and held very still, afraid to run and draw attention to ourselves. Matthias almost stepped on us. "Hey!" he cried. "What? Hey, I found puppies!" Bone and I did scramble away then. We ran straight for the shed and zipped through the door. Matthias ran after us and followed us to our nest. Hey, puppies, he said. "I won't hurt you." He held out his hand toward us. Bone growled at it. "I know you don't trust me," said Matthias. "I don't blame you. You don't know me." He paused. "Not yet, anyway." Bone and I left our nest then and backed into a corner. Matthias stood up, but he didn't approach us. "I'll be right back," he said. As soon as Matthias left the shed, Bone and I scooted out the door and ran for the woods. We hid in the woods, afraid to move about, but by the end of the day we felt brave enough to make our way to the garbage heap. When we did, I saw Matthias walking around the Marions' yard. He was holding something in his hand, and he was peering under bushes and around trees and in the sheds and playhouse. He didn't call out, though, as Mr. and Mrs. Marion had done one day when they couldn't find the noisy little girl. I realized now that Matthias didn't want his mother to know he had found puppies on the property. She wouldn't stand for that. We were Matthias's secret. We didn't want to be Matthias's secret, though. Mother had taught Bone and me to fear humans, so we tried to stay alert and keep out of Matthias's way. But one morning the rains came again, and after Bone and I had found breakfast and relieved ourselves, we returned to the shed. We were settling in for a cozy day with Yellow Man, the rain drumming on the roof, when the door flung open and in walked Matthias. "There you are," he said softly when he saw Bone and me. Matthias always spoke softly, not like his sister. He crouched down and held out his hand. I glanced over my shoulder. Yellow Man and the other cats had retreated to the farthest recesses of the nesting boxes. I was about to run for the corner when a scent, a wonderful, beautiful scent, reached my nose. Chicken. Matthias was offering us pieces of chicken. Bone and I couldn't bring ourselves to approach Matthias, but we didn't turn and run either. Matthias stretched his hand out as far as it would reach. Bone and I darted forward to snatch the chicken, and then we did retreat to the corner. Matthias grinned. "That's all for today," he said, and he left. But he returned with more chicken the next morning, and the next morning, and many mornings after that. By the third morning, Bone and I didn't feel that we needed to hide in the corner in order to eat our prizes. Matthias did nothing while we ate but sit and wait and watch. If Susan had been there then, she would have said that Matthias was patient. One morning Bone and I were eating our fabulous chicken breakfast when I realized that Matthias's hand was resting on my back. His other hand was resting on Bone's back. I was startled, but not so startled that I couldn't finish the chicken. The following morning Matthias stroked our heads while we ate. And then, one morning, he pulled me into his lap. I struggled at first, but Matthias kept patting me and murmuring, "You're such a good puppy, the best puppy ever. Good puppy, good puppy." He pulled Bone into his lap next, and Bone growled, but he didn't struggle too much. After that, I waited every morning for Matthias to come to the shed. Sometimes Bone waited too, sometimes he didn't. Matthias always brought chicken, and sometimes he brought a ball or a toy. I would eat the chicken, and then I would sit in Matthias's lap, or we would play in the grass behind the shed. I noticed that Matthias was careful to stay out of the sight of his house, as Bone and I were. At the height of the summer, something of fall was already in the air. Although I didn't realize it then, didn't know that the days would turn short and cold, and that food would become hard to find. It was during this time that Bone and I saw the man with the gun again, and one evening we heard a blast from the rifle. Bone stayed awake all the rest of that night. I had seen him do this on other nights, had watched as he woke from a deep sleep, sat up and listened to the coyotes in the hills, or to the voices from the Marions' porch. My brother was becoming restless. I loved our summer days, being greeted by Yellow Man in the morning, hunting or going to the garbage heap with Bone, waiting for Matthias romping in the woods, but Bone was tiring of our days, and he was becoming suspicious. He eyed the Marians, even Matthias, more warily than ever. He growled when he saw the man with the gun, and on the morning after the rifle blast, he decided to leave our home in the country. The highway. Very early on the morning after the shotgun blast, when the nighttime creatures were going to sleep and the humans hadn't awakened yet, Bone rolled off of our burlap bed, touched my nose with his, then slipped through the open door of the shed and out into the quiet. I stood in the doorway watching him and saw that he looked at me over his shoulder from time to time. He trotted along the row of bushes and paused at the garbage pile, but when he kept going, I knew he was leaving for good. I turned and looked behind me at the shed. I looked at the nesting boxes sheltering Yellow Man and the other sleeping cats and kittens, at the wheelbarrow that had been my first nest, at the mice in their hiding places. I looked around at it all, glowing a bit in the rising sun. The shed was my home. It was everything I knew. But Bone was leaving, so I ran after him. I was too young then to wonder what would happen at the shed that day without us, but now I think I know. Yellow Man would rise and stretch, creep out of his box and sniff the air. He would wait for me, wait to rub his head under my chin, but our nest would be empty, and I wouldn't come tumbling back from the woods or the garbage heap. So finally he would prowl around outside alone. He would look for me off and on for many days, and then he would forget about me. The shed mice would forget about us almost immediately. They would register that Bone and I were gone, and then they would continue with their foraging and eating and running about as if we had never lived in the shed in the first place. Matthias would never forget. I am fairly certain of that. I imagine that Matthias searched his yard for us for more days than Yellow Man did. He must have searched quietly, holding out his chicken and toys, searched the entire property, and then maybe even ventured off the property. And knowing what I had learned about emotions, I think he was probably sad for a very long time. If I had imagined these things when I was a puppy, though, if I had imagined Yellow Man waiting and Matthias searching, I would still have run after Bone. The shed might have been my home, and Yellow Man and Matthias might have been my companions, but without Mother, Bone was my world. I could not be separated from him. So I ran after my brother. I ran hard, yipping to let him know I was coming. Bone heard me and waited for me to catch up. Then we trotted along, shoulder to shoulder, until I realized I was as far from the shed as I had ever been. Behind me I could see the Marian's house, its chimneys and roofs among the tallest tree branches, swallows swooping by the attic windows. We hurried on. The next time I looked behind me, I could see only the chimney tops. The third time I looked, the house was gone. Bone and I made our way down a steep hill, stumbling through dense, dark woods. Then we walked along flatter terrain, walked and walked until I began to feel hungry, and I thought of the garbage pile and of fat rodents. I was thirsty, too, and presently Bone and I came to a stream and stood at the edge and took long drinks. Then we waded in. We were hot and the water was cold, and we could see small dark shapes darting back and forth just below the surface. Bone stared at the fish for a moment, then pounced on one with a large splash. I pounced too. We didn't catch anything, but pouncing was fun, and it made Bone frisky. He turned and ran at me, chasing me up the stream as far as a small waterfall. At the waterfall, we waded to the bank and continued through the woods. We kept the sun first at our fronts, then at our backs as it moved through the sky. By the time the day's heat was fading and the shadows felt cooler, our stomachs were rumbling, so we hunted. Then we rested, and then abruptly Bone stood up and trotted off. I followed him. This time Bone and I walked and walked until the trees became fewer and we could see their separate shadows, and the shadows were long. Finally there were no more trees, and we were walking through a field, and then I heard a swishing noise that reminded me of the sound of cars on the road to the Marian's house. Bone heard the noise too, and he stopped. He froze in place, and his ears stood up stiffly as he listened. The noise meant cars. I was sure of it, even though the whooshes weren't exactly the same as the ones at the Marian's. They were louder and quicker. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. I watched Bone. He began to walk again, more slowly. We saw an abandoned tractor in the field and made a wide circle around it. We saw a rabbit, and Bone ran at it, but the rabbit disappeared. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Where were all these cars I could hear? Bone, panting from his chase, stopped to catch his breath, and it was then that we saw the house. It was smaller than the Marians and sat at the edge of the field, tidy and somehow friendly looking, but Bone and I turned away from it and walked in the other direction. We walked until the field came to an end, and in front of us was a road, a highway, and there were the whooshes. One car after another zipped along the road. The cars went by so fast they looked blurry, and even when Bone and I retreated to the edge of the field, each car blew our ears back with a rush of hot wind as it sped by. I squinted my eyes against the dust and the wind and turned around. We could creep through the field again, avoid the house, and return to the woods where we could hunt. I was part way along a row of tall, scratchy plants when I realized Bone wasn't with me. He was still standing at the side of the road, and he was sniffing the air. An odor came to my nose. I sniffed too. Chicken, just like Matthias would bring us. The odor was coming from across the road. I ran back to Bone, strained to see past the rushing cars, and when there was a little break in the traffic, I saw a paper bag lying on its side. There was chicken in that bag, and Bone and I knew it. My mouth started to water, and I drooled as I stood at the edge of the field, separated from the chicken by 2 lanes of cars. Bone took a step forward, then another. I was right behind me when a truck whizzed by me. I jumped back, yelping. Bone glanced at me, then faced the traffic again. He looked as though he was getting ready to run, to bolt across the road and hope for the best, when suddenly one of the cars that had just sped by pulled to the side of the road and screeched to a stop. Other drivers honked their horns, but the people who had stopped, a man and a woman, ignored them. They jumped out of the car and ran to Bone and me. Bone still had his eyes on that bag of chicken, but I was watching the people, and I wanted to get away from them. I couldn't leave Bone, though. I let out a warning bark. Too late. The man scooped Bone into his arms, and the woman scooped me into her arms. "Look, they're just puppies!" the woman exclaimed. "What are they doing way out here?" The man looked sternly at Bone. "You guys could have gotten yourselves killed," he said. "This is a dangerous highway." "Well, honey, they don't know any better," said the woman. "They're little. They must have gotten lost." "Do they have any collars or tags?" asked the man, feeling around Bone's neck. Bone stiffened, jerked his head over his shoulder, and snapped at the man. The man almost dropped him. "Hey!" he shouted. "You little brat, don't do that again." He gave Bone a shake. "George, I just told you they don't know any better," said the woman. "Come on, let's get back in the car. It's not safe standing out here." I squirmed. The woman's hands around my body were not gentle as Matthias's had been. She held me too tightly, and it was hard to breathe. I looked desperately at Bone, who was struggling and twisting and growling at the man. George held him at arm's length. "They're scrappy," said the woman brightly. "They're a pain in the neck," George replied. He tucked Bone under one arm while he opened the door. "Stick 'em in the back, Marcy," he said. "That way they won't pee on us." He paused. "What are we going to do with them anyway?" "Keep 'em. They're cute. They'll settle down. They're probably just scared." This was true. Bone and I were petrified. We huddled on the floor of the car behind George and Marcy. I whimpered and whined, and the movement of the car made my stomach roll. "Here we are," Marcy said presently. The car turned a corner, and I threw up. "Blasted creatures," said George. "Now the car's going to stink to high heaven." "I'll clean it up," said Marcy. She peered over the seat at Bone and me. "Welcome to your new home."